Thanks for joining us today for our Family Dynamics webinar. Chris Pegg will begin presenting in just a moment, and we expect the presentation to take about 50 minutes. Everyone is muted as they join, but please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so we will be sure to address your questions then. We are recording the webinar, and the replay and slides will be available on our website, bwmfinancial.com. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Wealth Planning, Chris Pegg.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining this afternoon. We are going to talk about something that is a little bit different than we typically do. If you've seen me do these before, you've seen me talk about tax updates or business succession or planning strategies that exist. Certainly, if you've watched Jeff do these, then you have seen him go into great detail about our sort of data-driven, rules-based investment approach that we use and that people find so helpful. But today's a very different kind of conversation. However, I think our clients can get every bit as much from this conversation as they do from the others. So we're going to talk about how families can leverage wealth to improve family relationships and ultimately to improve the personal fulfillment of those individual family members. Certainly, a lot of the issues we're going to talk about today are specific to those families that have multi-generational wealth. And there are certain considerations as part of that process that we're going to be going over and some of the experience we've had with that. With that said, I will tell you that I think a lot of this can be beneficial to any of our clients or any of our prospects who are looking to improve financial communication within the family. So with that, let's get started. I am going to move on to the slide. Before I get into the 6-point framework that we've developed, I wanted to put this information up because there are a couple of things about this that I want to discuss. First, I want to give us a little bit of scope, right? We are looking at $68 trillion of wealth transferring starting now and will continue over the years to come. And of course, the source of this is the Wall Street Journal. And we want to understand the fact that this is going to happen. So like so many things in life, this transfer is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. And we can choose to ignore that. We can choose to have no conversations about it, or we can choose to make them sort of sporadic conversations that never really get to the heart of the issue. But if we do that, we do it at our family's financial peril. Because these structures, and we have had such experience with that, all of us here and people in the wealth management business have seen what it's like when we don't communicate appropriately about these issues. So we're going to talk about that. I also bring this up because, first of all, I love this picture. I love the concept that looking at that hand once looked like the one that was on top of it. And I think that gives you a real perspective on generational planning. And maybe it doesn't have any more meaning than just the aesthetics of it, but I really like that picture. But I also wanted to bring up the transfer concept. So we have this idea of there is a moment of transfer. When is the transition of wealth going to occur? If we can identify the moment that the transfer happened, if we can define with specificity when the transfer of wealth occurred, then we have failed miserably, because we are not trying to prepare the heirs to receive the wealth. We're not going to at some point flip a toggle switch and throw them the keys and say, here's to, now you're running the wealth generation, the wealth generating business or anything else. And that comes up a lot. That happens when we don't plan. That transition is identifiable. What we want instead is to take time over years to help increase family members' awareness of the various considerations and the complexities that exist around wealth. That's our goal. And when you see successful transfer, that's how it occurs. It's because we've been planning for it and we've been communicating about it. You're going to hear me say that more than once. Okay, let's get started. So, as I said, based on the experience we've had working with families, we've developed a 6-point framework that sort of encapsulates the important components of an overall family dynamic wealth strategy that we communicate to the entire family. And we're going to talk about those. There are the 6 that are here, right? The connect, cultivate, communicate, condition, care, and conserve. I'm going to walk through those sequentially, but I want to be very clear that these are not phases in a transition. We're not going to finish the connect phase, so then we're ready for the cultivate phase. This is more like it's a constellation of concepts that we can pull in at any given time. And there are many times in this overall family dynamics wealth planning process that we're going to be using 2 or 3 at the same time. That'll come up a little bit today. So we're going to analyze each of the components. And again, I'll analyze them in order, but that is not because it's a sequence. These are not phases. This is an overall approach. All of these are components of an overall approach. The other thing I want to mention is one of these here is called communicate. That's, of course, each of these words indicates some concepts that we're going to get into more detail about. One of them is called communicate. Maybe I should think of a different word for that, because what I don't like there is the indication that communication is only part of that phase or that component. Communication suffuses this entire process. In fact, if any of these components, you had to pick one word that identifies that component, communicate or communication might be the word for each of them. So I want to be very clear that open communication is going to be critical, and it's going to be a big part of how we handle this going forward. Okay, so let's start with connect. What do we mean when we say connect in this process? The connection component is a specific, defined moment when we are going to choose a location and a time. We're coming together as a family to discuss very specifically these issues. And that is a critical step to really creating the kind of communication that we need. So you will often have clients that say, you know what, feels like our family's pretty connected about this. We sort of understand the wealth strategy. My daughter works in the business. She sort of gets it. And then the family has been involved. We've been working with the CPA. We've been working with the attorney. And so they sort of understand how the overall wealth structure works. And, you know, if you're an advisor and you want to be a little bit passive aggressive, what you say is, okay, great. So mom and dad, why don't you sit on the side of the table here with me, and let's look to the children and let's ask them to define what that wealth strategy is, what that wealth plan is. And that gets pretty quiet pretty quick. We also see frequently, and this comes, I see this in male clients a lot. When we talk about how we discuss this, a client will say, my children don't seem all that interested in what our plan is for the wealth. That seems strange to me. You think that they're not interested in the overall plan for this generational wealth. Well, you know, 2 Thanksgivings ago, I brought up the fact that I'm going to leave a trust for them, and nobody asked any questions. Well, what did you expect in that circumstance? Was the record supposed to stop, and then the clients would your children would begin to ask, like, well, when is the money available, Dad? And does this happen before you're gone, or is it after you've passed away? And should we keep saving money for college? Because it's becoming really hard for Julie and I to find money for the 529 plan and everything. What reaction did you expect from that family who had no pretext? You didn't discuss anything about that before. And if I had to guess, I'll bet we moved off that conversation topic pretty quickly. So this is the part where we say, or let me say, the reason those children couldn't define what the wealth plan is, and the reason those other children seemed somewhat disinterested, is because they were never truly given license to ask questions. We never in any specific way deputized them to really dig into the details. So that is what this process is. That's what the connect piece is. We're going to be very specific about where we're doing this and what we're discussing. First, we'll start with where we're meeting. We want to pick a place that is emotionally neutral or positive. Now, very frequently, clients will say, well, the family home, that's a great spot for this. They have wonderful memories there of holidays and all of the things. And that may absolutely be true, and the home may be the right space. It may be that everyone in the family really has some positive connotations with the home. I would only say you might want to investigate that a little bit. Keep in mind that we're going to have some conversations, and some of those are probably going to involve this home. There may be some difficult conversations about what happens to this home if mom and dad choose to leave or if they pass away. Who sort of deserves the home? What happens to it? Maybe there's a younger sibling who doesn't have the same recollection of that home and doesn't have the same positive feelings about it. Just investigate, interrogate that a little bit. And if you have any concerns about it, let's pick somewhere neutral. Pick a restaurant that you like that has a nice place in the back. Certainly this can be done at a resort. You can make a 2 or 3 day vacation out of this, bring the larger extended family, and then we'll find time for these specific connection meetings. We just want to be somewhere that is totally emotionally neutral. The second thing we need to be very clear about what we're doing here is we want a detailed, specific agenda. Now, we want the agenda for a couple of different reasons. Number one, we need to give the family members a heads up. We need to say this is going to be a very specific meeting with some very specific purposes. We are going to be discussing things that we have never discussed in the past, or if this is the first one of these that we have not discussed in the past. You are going to be asked to give feedback that might make you slightly uncomfortable. And we want that to be there because we don't want people walking into this meeting thinking, maybe mom and dad are going to have a big reveal. They had a 23andMe prepared and they're going to show us the results of that. That, by the way, would be a wonderful component of this meeting. You could do that, or you could do the other website that is, I forget the name, but the one that does the history, ancestry.com. Or you could go to the people who do that professionally, and they do a fantastic job. You can get wonderful reports about the history of the family. That certainly can be a component of that meeting, but the family has to understand very clearly what we're going to be discussing. That some of the aspects of this meeting are going to require some feedback, they're going to require some thought, and they're going to require some conversation that has not been had before. The other reason that the agenda is really, really critical is we need to give family members some time to ruminate about this. Again, when we're saying to them, you are going to be in with your family and we're going to be discussing some of the estate planning concerns, some of the things that have happened in the past, some of the things we want to have happen in the future. These are conversations you are not used to having, and so they need to be able to think about what kind of questions do they have with regard to this? What has their conversation within the family been in the past? And even to sort of emotionally gird themselves, anyone who has been in this practice for any amount of time has had an experience where you're having these kind of generational conversations, and very surprisingly, very quickly, we get an eruption of tears, and that typically goes away quickly. But it's not because something sad was discussed, it's because we are talking very frequently about the practicalities of generational shift and of death. We have not maybe really considered in the past what the practicalities of mom and dad's death will be. And if we're talking about generational planning, we've probably also not talked about how your kids are going to exist once you are gone. Those can be difficult, and we need the family to be prepared for that. We need them to understand how important that will be. Okay, so a couple of things here that I've got that I'll bring up on the slide. I don't like the cop icon. That was maybe a mistake. Should have come up with something else. But it gives the right indication, right? What this means is we are going to set some rules for this conversation. First and foremost, this place, this connection meeting, the conversations we have, this is going to be a safe space. And we're going to give one another a lot of grace, because every family member, or excuse me, every family has its own sort of set of landmines that exist. And we are going to do our best to ensure that if someone takes an errant step on one of those landmines, we diffuse that rather than let it end the conversation or let it cause a larger issue. We're going to realize that these are conversations that haven't been had. Sometimes the expression you're looking for isn't on your tongue. Sometimes the way you want to describe your concern is not easy to describe. It's not easy to come up with. So we want to give people the space for that. We also want to be clear that this is going to be entirely confidential. So we want to provide as much freedom for the attendees as possible, and that requires confidentiality, except of course to the extent that you all agree that we can share something with extended family or other advisors. But otherwise, the comments there are confidential. And then of course, because every family is unique, everyone will have their own special set of rules. But at least, at the very minimum, we're not going to talk over one another. This sort of comes back to the grace issue, right? We are going to give people the space to try to communicate what they're saying, to try to get out their feedback. We're going to want the feedback from those that struggle a little bit to have these conversations. And so we're going to give each other space, and we're not going to step on one another. The next point here is we're going to minimize the invitation list, at least, especially early. What I mean by early is if this is the first time we've done this, we want to be very selective, and we probably want to keep it to absolute sort of immediate family. We all have people in our lives. We all have in-laws that have been part of this family for decades. We have maybe advisors who have been advising us for decades, and we're treated just like family. And I completely appreciate that. And they can have a place in this later. The difference, though, with the second generation, and at least the second and third generation, is unlike in-laws, unlike those advisors that are trusted, they've been part of this family since the day they were born. They have no other context for how this kind of thing should be done. They have no other context for what these conversations should look like, what questions they should be asking, what level of sophistication they should have. And if we have those other people in the room who do have another family, who do have a different context, it can create a little bit of maybe an emotional echo, because the daughter maybe who's trying to ask a question can't help but in the back of her mind think, are we sounding spoiled to these people? Do we seem greedy? Do we seem naive? Do we seem financially unsophisticated? You don't want family members thinking about those issues as part of this process, especially when you raise it for the first time. So you want that immediate family where everyone has been in this since the beginning, and they all understand the emotional issues and the interactions that have happened throughout the decades, starting again from birth. So that's a really important point about how we treat those individuals, or why we keep that list very small. The only exception to that, and this is a little bit of a commercial for BWM Financial as well as other great facilitators who do this, is as part of this conversation, you may in fact want one objective facilitator for this process. We have the agenda, we know what we're trying to accomplish. You might want someone there who has experience dealing with the emotional hurdles that come up as part of this process, as part of these conversations. They can help facilitate it and make sure the conversation keeps going in the right ways. We can pull from those who are more reticent to speak the feedback that we need from them. We can also ensure that maybe the more voluble or talkative family members aren't taking up too much of the allotted time for a given topic. They can really be a help, and we'll talk more about that as we go. The only other thing, well, here, so let me go to this next slide here. So this sort of, we talked about this, right? We set the invite, we get the agenda, we maybe decide on a host, and then we establish the next steps. The only other thing I will mention about family members, I said we keep it to the close immediate family, maybe with the exception of someone who can serve as a facilitator. Are there ever immediate family members that we don't invite? There are at least two times that I can think about that I can think that it's correct that we should not invite someone. I'm sure there are more, but these two tend to come up. If an immediate family member has an untreated bipolarity or some other mental stability issue, or if an immediate family member is in the throes of addiction, in those circumstances, those family members should not be invited. It's too emotionally detrimental to the conversation. It's funny because when you see that, not funny, it's odd or maybe interesting. When you see that, and you see it frequently in families, especially unfortunately families of means, you will see that actually the siblings don't have an issue. The siblings have calloused, especially if this is long-term behavior. The siblings have calloused. They still very much appreciate and love their brother, let's say, but they've created an emotional distance very intentionally to protect themselves, which is totally understandable. The problem is with the senior generation, because they never see anything but their wounded child, and that doesn't callous over, and it hurts every time. And so it's too much to bring them into that kind of meeting. It's too difficult already. We're already going to be discussing things that are so freighted with emotion that we simply can't permit something like that to cause trouble. By the way, every family that deals with this is unique, and every problem is unique. But the sort of message you want to be sending there is something akin to, almost always the message should be something like, this family, we will do anything we can to help you get through this, get over it, deal with this issue. But we will not allow the family's wealth to exacerbate this illness. And, you decide on your next steps from there, but they should definitely not be part of this meeting. Okay, that bummer aside, let me move on to the next component here, and that's the cultivate piece. So we've got our connection, we know where we're going to be, we know why we're here, and we're going to be open and receptive, and we're going to give our feedback. The connection part, the cultivate piece is, it's like the historical part of the family. How did they develop this success, right? How did, what was it that that wealth generating generation did, and how can the next generation leverage that experience to create success of their own? What were the behaviors and the principles that senior generation followed that created this success? What can be interesting here is this is especially true if the wealth generating generation was tremendously successful. There can develop an almost mythic quality about how that happened. There can be this idea that, gosh, mom, when she was young, she leveraged everything she had, and she bought this one piece of property, and it was the perfect investment. And then she took advantage of that, and she was able to grow to multiple pieces there. And she leveraged that, and she created this real estate portfolio, this empire that you see now that has been developed. And she was so attuned to the market. She's sort of the Queen Midas. That's a wonderful feeling for the senior generation. It's wonderful to be thought of that way. And it's even really nice for the second and third generation to be able to take some pride in that, to be able to see that and think, wow, what an unbelievable job. What skill she has. It's, mom is superhuman in her abilities there. The issue, though, is what's sort of the unsaid corollary there to mom being superhuman? What's the intimation? The silent message is, you, mere human, are not capable of that. You don't have her innate ability, her innate sense for the market. And therefore, almost by definition, we know that things are going to go poorly when this gets transitioned to the second generation. At least it won't go as well as it's gone in the past because you don't have those abilities. And so we have to be really careful about that. When the senior generation starts thinking about what we're going to communicate in the Cultivate section, when we're going to talk about what's important to us, those fundamental principles that got success for us, you want to think about the history that you've had. You want to focus on some of those moments. And here are some of the moments that you want to focus on. You want to spend specific time describing in detail those moments when you were scared to death. You want to discuss those times when you did not feel like you knew what the heck you were doing, or the market did something funny and you thought you might lose everything all at once. You want to talk about that investment that the kids don't even know about because you sold it at a loss decades ago. Talk about those failures, talk about those hurdles, talk about the struggles, but then come back to those principles and those behaviors that got you through those moments. That's what we're looking to capture in that part of the conversation. The other thing we have to do is we have to talk about how the environment today is different. Society is evolving so fast right now. I know that every generation sort of says, well, the old generation doesn't get it. That's eminently true now, right? Everything evolves so quickly that we have to acknowledge that. If we don't, we very much risk the second or third generation feeling like this advice is antiquated or obsolete because we are in such a new economy, such a new society. So how do we handle that? Well, we talk about what's different. We talk about the fact that deals happen at a different pace now. We talk about the fact that relationships among professionals are different, and the communication, and again, the speed and the complexity of things that occur. The people we sell to, our customers operate differently than they used to. The people we're trying to buy supplies from operate differently. The real estate market itself is wildly different because of the information that everybody has. Talk about those things. Talk about what's different. Acknowledge that. Again, come back to those timeless values that can be successful even in this new economy. Think about how you can describe it even in spite of all of these changes. If we appropriately employ those concepts, those values, we are going to be able to have success even today and in the future when society will look nothing like it does today. These values, these important pieces are timeless for us. Okay. The next thing that we've got to do is once we've really thought through, I think I've made pretty clear that, I went the wrong way here. Once we've thought through what those values are, what those principles are, what those behaviors are, we are going to memorialize those. We're going to write them down in a mission statement. And understandably, this is often sort of the heavy lift for the client, right? This is the part where they go, it's the Stephen Covey portion of the presentation. It absolutely is the Stephen Covey portion of the presentation, because we want to tangibly memorialize these things that we've discussed. We can write about them in glowing language, or it can be in bullet points, or it can be some combination of that. And it will certainly evolve over time as we continue to have these connection meetings. This mission statement is going to be there. These values are going to be there, and those are going to evolve in the way we describe them, the way we think that they're important. That's going to change over time. But now we have this tangible record of what it was that we found to be so critical. And I'm going to talk more about why that's important. And so I hope that by the end of this, it'll be clear why capturing that and utilizing that for every one of these connection meetings is critical. And it starts with this. What that means when we create this and we all agree and we put it in a document that we agree to, perhaps even sign, what we're saying is we recognize the behaviors and the values that created success for the family. We recognize those things that can be leveraged to continue to create success in the future. And we also acknowledge and recognize what is expected of you as a member of this family. These are the things that have worked for us, and these are the things that you are expected to do as part of this. There is, this is sort of the Spider-Man piece. With great wealth comes great responsibility. You are in this family. There has been wonderful financial success, and now there are certain obligations that you're going to have. You will sometimes, I have gotten feedback in the past when we go through this structure, you can't mandate people to live by any certain kind of code. I mean, even if they kind of agree to it, you can't, without their acceptance or real true acceptance, you can't make them do that. I would say, yes, you absolutely can. We all do that all the time. I have expectations of my children that are not optional. I expect them to behave a certain way. I may not have written it down for them so that they can see those things, but I hope that my wife and I have made that very clear. Certainly my parents had expectations for me. So having expectations and requiring that people behave a certain way to be a cohesive family is not unusual. What's maybe a little different is we're going to tangibly capture it. And we're going to have that to work from going forward. And that is going to be a critical component to this for reasons that we'll discuss. Okay. The next portion of this, the next sort of component, is the communication piece. Now, this is from a communication, again, I said the whole thing's communication. You're probably starting to get a sense of that. But the communicate portion is about, this is where we share the plan. This is where we talk about the financial world for this family as it exists. We're going to get very specific in a lot of ways, not necessarily down to the dollar, depending on the things you're dealing with. We can talk a little bit more about that. But we are really going to go into the detail around this. You can get some pushback on this part. The wealth generating generation, for instance, can often have a struggle with this component of it, or going into it, they have some discomfort. That is because, not because they developed the wealth, but because they, like the vast majority of us, grew up in a family that did not have intergenerational wealth. And in those families, like most of ours, you just didn't talk about wealth like that. You certainly, even as an adult child, did not impertinently ask about your parents' wealth. What are you going to leave me when you're gone? What do you make, mom and dad? How did you pay for the house? How much was it? What in the business? What is the gross versus the net? How much profit do you pull out of there every year? You don't talk about those things. And we all were marinated in that concept when we were young. And because we were marinated in it when we were young, you will carry that forever. You will carry that discomfort till the day you die in all likelihood. So what we have to do for that senior generation is we're going to have to acknowledge that some of this might be a little uncomfortable. We're going to have to get over that initial hurdle. We want to get to a place, and it's not easy, but we want to get to a place where talking at least to the next generation, maybe not the third generation down just yet, depending on their maturity. We want to get to a place where that conversation among generations is more like the conversation that spouses have about finances. It's typically open, and it's typically there's nothing to hide there. We know where everything is, and we know why it is the way that it is. You might still have one of the spouses that has the insight on what we're going to invest in next, or the operations of the business, but both are together in their open communication around that. That's really sort of the goal for that next generation, if they're financially stable and capable and mature, if they're capable of handling. That's really what you're looking for. So we want to bring them on board, and we want to create just free dialogue so that the connection meetings become much easier in the future. The second reason that a lot of our clients will say, listen, I don't want to talk about this, even if I can get over the discomfort I have personally, I don't want to disincentivize these children. If they recognize the amount of wealth that is out there and that they stand possibly to benefit from, inherit, or at least have access to in some way, well, then what's to drive them to be a professional success and the things like that? Well, I'm going to come back to that in a second. But as an aside, let me just say, it's an interconnected world. Your children know. They are aware of what is out there. They may not know it to the dollar figure, and they may not know exactly how things operate, but they know that their business exists. They know where the investments are. They certainly know where you live, and they know the kinds of things you do with your leisure time. There is a recognition of that wealth. So trying to hide it from them, or obfuscate, or refuse to disclose any of that is not in anyone's interest, because it just won't work. Now, it's a fair point that how do we avoid disincentivizing children when they know family wealth is out there? We'll talk a little bit more about that, but let me say now, this is why we come back to the mission statement. This is why we come back to those timeless values and principles and behaviors, because we are going to discuss the plan as it exists, the overall financial structure as it exists, and we're going to discuss that in concert with those requirements we have of you and the behaviors that we absolutely expect from members of this family. So with all that said, and once we're clear about everything, and there's no sort of guessing about the structures anymore. We're going to really get into the financial structures. We're going to talk about the investments, the partnerships, the businesses, the estate planning that exists. What estate planning exists now? What are we going to put on in the future? And then what ultimately happens upon someone's death? How are we going to deal with that? We want to be talking about what happens tomorrow, what happens next year, a decade from now, and 2 generations from now. What is the structure like for those people? You want to talk about, or for the family with regard to these things. And you want to talk very specifically about the flexibility of the plan, and you want to discuss with clarity why some of these things exist. Sometimes those of us who are in the industry, and then of course that senior generation has been dealing with this for a long time, things seem obvious. What is a family limited partnership? Why do we have that? It seems so obvious to us and intuitive. You've got to remember, we might need to put some education around that. We might need to explain why a family limited partnership would exist. Why is there an irrevocable trust? Do you not trust me? Why would we do that? Of course, that's not the case. We do it for a bunch of reasons that we'll get into some detail on as part of that conversation, because we want the family to understand where this is coming from. Okay, again, coming back to that mission statement, coming back to those values, we are going to use that as part of the next component, which is the conditioning. Again, these interlock in many ways. So I'm not moving through phases. I'm just talking about some various things and the ways they're going to be discussed as part of the overall connection. We are going to discuss how we have conditioned the wealth for family members. Some families still use essentially outright distributions, right? Where the wealth transfers typically upon the passing of the senior generation, it transfers to the next generation as sort of a portion of their birthright. That is effective. It can be very dangerous. We have all seen how poorly that can go when it's done incorrectly or without sufficient communication. But more and more now, we're seeing strategies and beneficial ways of structuring the wealth over time that's far superior to outright distributions, even if you would otherwise give it outright. The strategies now can provide total control, total flexibility for those individuals to whom you would have given it outright, but provide them extra protection that they didn't know was possible for them. But we're going to have to go through the education process so they understand that. That's the conditioning piece. We're going to talk about the conditions around this wealth. There's sort of a dichotomy that the idea of the senior generation, wants a hand from the grave, and the junior generation wants it outright. They want it to be free and clear. That may still be true in some sort of characterization, but it's really very different today. Again, with the appropriate education for all generations, you're going to come to a realization that there are a lot of strategies that are available to accomplish all of the goals in a much better way than outright distributions. And we'll talk some about why that is in a minute. But then we have to be thinking about, what are the conditions for this? What do we want to incentivize? Do we want to incentivize education? Do we want to incentivize work? Obviously, professional success, home ownership, entrepreneurial risk, travel. How do we want to do that for these various families? And do we want to make outright distributions so that family members can go do those things? Or do we want to create like a family bank that can lend money to family members so that they can take risks they couldn't otherwise take if they didn't have access to these funds? Maybe we want to incentivize getting together at just bringing families back together. Maybe we want to purchase or maintain a family vacation home. And maybe we want to set aside some pretty significant assets to pay for the upkeep and to pay for travel, to bring the families back together on a regular basis, to have these kind of family retreats so that we can have these condition meetings. We can have the connection meetings as part of that process. And it becomes a regular thing. And then it does become possible to maybe include close in-laws and advisors and things like that. Those are really important and often very successful ways of incentivizing behavior, conditioning the behavior of those family members going forward. The other thing I would say about this process, and again, today is not about strategies. Today is not about exactly how the specific techniques we use, but there are going to be times when you need to think about how would you want the wealth to be used in certain circumstances. And I will say this, do not try to think about or do not try to plan for every contingency that can happen over the next century. That would be ridiculous. You can imagine if in 1922, you were trying to condition wealth, you're fresh out of World War I, and now you're trying to protect a certain amount of wealth and condition how it gets used by the family going forward. It would be impossible to think about how that wealth should be used in a time of social media, in a time of the sort of political polarization that we have now and the things that are occurring now. So instead, you're going to see a theme here. Instead of thinking about what the conditions and all possible things that could exist in the future are going to be, we're going to describe those values that are in our mission statement. We're going to talk about the principles and the behaviors that we know are timeless for success. Those should be included in some of these strategies. And along with that, a very detailed way of deciding how our trustees and our other advisors are going to be selected. Some may be family, some may be entirely objective. But we're going to create a process for that we can all be comfortable with, so that with those principles in place, ensconced in the document itself and the selection process, we can allow that document on its face to evolve with society. Because so long as we're selecting the right individuals who understand what those timeless values are, then they can look at society as it exists when they find it and choose to deploy the funds and the assets in a way that make the most sense. So that's a really critical piece. We have, again, all of us in the industry have seen documents that do way too much in an attempt to protect beneficiaries from everything, in an attempt to contemplate all possible events that could come up. And those provisions just end up looking absurd, even simply a decade later. So those are the ways to think about, and again, we come back to why that mission statement is so important. It plays such a critical role in this entire process. Okay, after condition, we're talking about care. Now, care is a different sort of structure. Care is about the fact that almost all generationally wealthy families have some sort of structured philanthropic process that brings the family together to help them decide on how and when we're going to help various causes. Almost every family of significant means will have, though they will acknowledge, of course, that they put sweat and tears into creating the success that exists, but they will acknowledge typically that they were blessed in some ways. There was some luck involved, and so they feel an obligation to sort of give back, as the quip goes. But I will say that creating this process, this giving process, this care piece, done through family foundations typically, but can be done in lots of different ways. Again, I won't get into the complexities right now, but this overall idea is tremendously advantageous for the family itself. It creates some incredible opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. So where we see successful wealth transfer through generations, almost always there is a significant philanthropic component to those plans. And so typically what you want is the family getting together. So if we have this family foundation, we want the family coordinated on what things are we trying to support? In what ways are we going to support that? What's the time frame for those things? And that can be a great topic for our connection meetings, right? It doesn't all have to be somber and difficult conversations. Some of it can be about the money that we spent on charities and the great things that our foundation got to do, or the returns on the investments, et cetera. And the other huge benefit of doing like a family foundation or something similar is that you can involve every family member, or at least, again, you may want to keep it to direct family, but you can involve any level of sophistication. Even very young children can be involved in this process. because we're talking about giving money to charity and doing good, and we can use that as an amazing education process. So for instance, when we have a young child and we say, yes, we have this foundation, we have money in the foundation. Well, what do we do with it? Do we just leave it in a checking account? We probably shouldn't, right? If this money is going to be given to good causes, we want that money to grow as we decide what we're going to do. So we're going to invest that money in some various things. What does that mean? What is an investment? Why would I do that rather than just keep it in cash? Or why wouldn't I actually go to the ATM, pull it all out and leave it under the mattress? Why are we doing that? And that gives a perfect opportunity to mentor someone to be able to discuss those issues. Think about budgeting. No matter how big the foundation is, it's not infinite, it's not limitless. We're going to have to decide where we choose to use the funds that we have available to us and where we can have the most impact. Administratively, think about the things that they get to learn. They get to see what is a CPA really doing? What is the tax attorney's role here? What are these annual filings? Why does the IRS care what we're doing here? What is that process? And they learn about the complexities involved in wealth in a very oblique way, because we're not talking about the family wealth. We're not sharing with them numbers and saying, don't go talking to your sibling or don't go talking to your friends about this. We are talking about a charitable organization, but they are getting that wonderful education as part of that process. Think about something as simple but as meaningful as due diligence. Think about a child saying, "Hey, I'd like to help the environment." Well, that's great. There's lots and lots of charitable causes that will help the environment. Lots of glossy pamphlets out there. Lots of really slick websites. How are we going to decide where to deploy these funds? How are we going to decide what part maybe of the environment we want to impact? And how are we going to decide the most effective people to help us do that? Maybe we're going to need to investigate. If this is a substantial contribution, which it very likely will be, then maybe we need to go visit that charity. Maybe we need to ask some questions. We need to find out what they do with those funds when they get them. That's an incredible way of starting to learn that it's not always about what's advertised. And sometimes you can find people that are incredibly effective but quiet. Sometimes you find great salesmen and they don't really ever get to the bottom line. The rubber never meets the road, so to speak. So that's an amazing training ground for them. The other training aspect, and this is true, typically you want to keep the family coordinated in their charitable giving. You can segregate certain things. Someone might become an expert in one issue and then help inform the overall family about how money should be spent. But for the most part, you want to be coordinated on those decisions. The exception to that are the children, right? Or even anyone who's minor, and I guess up to maybe 25, 30 years old. You want to give them some agency. You want to say, here are some funds set aside from you. You've decided that the environment is important to you. Do with this what you would like. Give to the charitable funds that you would like. And at the next connection meeting on the agenda will be your opportunity to explain to us where the money went and what the money did. That is an incredible opportunity for those children to really start to understand the sophistication involved in wealth and the ways that you can talk about it among family members. So as I said, not to belabor the point, almost all effective families who are training their overall generations about wealth, almost all of them have a significant giving component. Okay, the final sort of component to this is conserve. Now, that the conserve portion is what people probably more traditionally think about when they think about wealth planning. So this is the part where we are thinking through how does control ultimately transfer? What are the asset protection concerns that we have? What tax mitigation strategies are available? How do we, for instance, introduce control to the next generation? Not full control, but how do we involve them more fully in some of the decisions so that they can be prepared to be the senior generation when that time comes? The strategies that are involved in the conserve piece are part of that. How do we protect these assets from creditors of the family? How do we ensure that if one of the siblings gets into a business deal, signs a guarantee, and that blows up, how do we ensure that the family assets aren't going to be liable for that guarantee? How do we deal with current and unfortunately future ex-spouses? How are we going to ensure that the family wealth is not bleeding away in those circumstances? How do we protect wealth from the family itself? How do we protect it from spendthrift behavior, sort of general profligacy, which, unfortunately comes up a lot in wealthy families? And those are things we have to deal with. And then finally, of course, how do we ensure that every time we try to make a transition of this wealth to the next generation, we want to have them participate in the wealth and have the success and continue on? How do we avoid losing half of it to the government every time we do that? Those are the kinds of things we're talking about in the Conserve portion. Again, they're not phases, right? As I hope you're starting to see now, these are all components, and any one of them can come up at a different time. And we're not getting into any of the specific strategies, although, of course, if you'd like to talk about any of that, please let us know. Okay. The 7 is not really part of our structure, but it's just, again, a little commercial for us, which is we can help facilitate these processes. Every family that we deal with is unique, but there are certain strategies, there are certain processes that can have a very positive effect on almost any family that's in this process. We can help structure this from the ground up, or we can help strengthen a process that you already have. Maybe there are families who really are communicating well. They just haven't been intentional enough about their decision making, and they haven't really brought this together. Maybe they haven't actually done the mission statement. And maybe we need to explain to them why that can be so critical as part of this process, because our goal, as I mentioned at the beginning, is to help our families leverage that wealth to create personal fulfillment. We want to bring the families closer because of the wealth, and we want to create a personal fulfillment, or at least ensure that the wealth doesn't get in the way of that. Okay, so summary here, connect, right? We're going to get together, we're going to be very specific, and we're going to know why we're meeting, we're going to know where we're meeting, and we're going to be ready to have the kind of conversations that are necessary. We're going to cultivate. We're going to talk about how we had the success in the future. We're going to get into the behaviors and the values that are so critical and timeless. And then we're going to express how that behavior is expected of you as well as part of this family. We're going to communicate. We're going to say, this is what the plan is currently. This is our ideas for the future. And then we can talk more about the strategies that can be used for that. We talk about the conditions. What are we concerned about? What is it that we want to ensure these funds are used for? And if we would otherwise give it outright, how can we do it in a way that actually provides more abilities for the families and the generations to come, ensuring that, of course, we don't lose tons of it to taxes and the like. And then care. If I haven't said it enough, this is a critical education moment, and it's the best way to involve that third generation. Very hard sometimes to bring them into some of the more detailed conversations, but we do need to make them aware they are going to be part of a wealthy family. They are going to be part of a sophisticated financial family. And so we need to find a way to start educating them about that now. Family foundations, there's just really no better way to do it than that. And then finally, Conserve. We are going to pay attention. We are going to ensure that we don't let any slip away any more than has to. We are going to do everything we can to protect this wealth, because certainly there are going to be issues coming up. So I will go to the disclosure slide, which I'm required to do. And then Chris, if there are any questions out there, I'd love to hear them. I know I'm almost up against time here, so I apologize.
Yeah, we did get a couple questions, Chris. The first one here, how should we handle second or third generation family members who are important but don't want to participate?
That's a good question. It does come up, but if you're seeing that, first of all, there's a couple things that are going wrong. Number one, this agenda has not been clear enough. It is very hard to imagine that we're going to say, hey, listen, the family has a lot of wealth, and we're all going to get together and decide how exactly that should be dealt with over time, including in your generation. And you just don't have the time to make it. That's typically not a great strategy, and it's pretty unusual. Sort of like back to World War I that I mentioned. It's like for any history buffs out there, I think it was the Italians that left the negotiations at the Treaty of Versailles. Things don't go very well when you leave the negotiations, right? You want to be there and to talk about the things that you have concerns about. What I suspect actually is happening, unless we haven't been clear about the agenda and people are just sort of tired for whatever reason of family meetings, and you haven't been clear about there's something else going on. There's some underlying issue that needs to be addressed. And that communication does not have to happen in front of the whole family. We can say, listen, here's what we're doing. We can have siblings talk to them. We can have senior generation. Here's what we're trying to accomplish here. Why wouldn't you want to participate in that? Let's really get below that and figure out what's there. Because the idea that it's just, gosh, I don't want to fly all the way from Colorado to Santa Barbara to hear about this stuff, especially with Zoom as it exists today, although I don't recommend that, to be very honest. I mean, Zoom has been fantastic. We work with our clients a lot on it. These are the kind of things that I would suggest you do in person, where you can smell one another. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, but that's my impression about what would be happening there.
Thanks, Chris. Another question came in. What is your experience in dealing with blended families where some of the next generation might be favored differently than others?
So that's another great question. And that does happen. One thing I will mention, we didn't talk about this before, maybe even taking it back to that addicted personality I talked about before. Maybe we have a family member who's over the addiction, right? But we still, and probably always have those concerns. Sometimes those personalities are always on the edge. And so our wealth plan for that person is going to be very different than the wealth plan for everyone else. It could be something similar in a blended family situation. We're going to treat them differently for some reason. There's no reason why we couldn't have an initial conversation outside of this larger Connect meeting to discuss those issues. And there's also no reason why at the outset of a meeting or when topics come up, we can simply say, we're going to talk about the structure for most of the family. There are some differences with regard to Phil, and we don't need to get into the details of that. And that is an issue for Phil and the senior generation to discuss. So we're going to keep our focus on these other pieces. That's not comfortable. And it also says to the rest of the family, like, hey, we're not sharing with you right now what's happening. And so that can create a little bit of tension. And keep in mind, they will ultimately find out. I mean, over time, they're going to figure out what this looks like. But you can take time ahead of the meeting to say, these are certain topics that we're going to keep out of this conversation. These are verboten for the moment because they're going to create too many issues that we are not trying to deal with as part of this process. That would be my best advice, not, of course, knowing the specifics of what we're dealing with. If you would like to connect, whoever asked that question would like to connect with me personally about that specific issue, I can be more creative about how to deal with that. It's interesting. I've told people this before, but my father was an attorney and my mother was a family therapist. And though I am an attorney by background and have been practicing and was practicing for a number of years, have been helping with wealth planning, 90% of what I do, I learned from my mother. 90% of what I do is about family therapy. Even when we're talking about documents and things like that, the legal side is sort of the easy part, I guess you could say. Anything else, Chris?
Yeah, there's a few questions about what age for children is it appropriate to start having this kind of conversation?
So it's a great question. Let me say it for the 8th time. This is why those foundations can be so impactful. There is no minimum age for that because all we're talking about is this objective wealth that is there for charities and how can we best steward that wealth? What can we do and how can we have the most impact with that wealth? But within that, because of all the reasons I talked about, we're going to get into some very sophisticated wealth concerns. When it comes to what should you know about the family, keep in mind earlier than you think, because Google is there. And you can guarantee that by the time they could say Google, they were looking for some information about the family as a whole. They recognize perhaps that they are different than other children. They recognize that some of the things that happen to them and the places that they go and the things that they do are different than others. And so they're going to start looking. You need to cut that off. There's certainly no way to prohibit them from doing that. So my general reaction is do it earlier than you think. We don't have to get down to dollar figures, but we should talk about what the business is. Maybe the family has made a lot of money through a business. Why has that been successful? What is it that it does? What do we expect for it in the future? Do we expect that this child will have an opportunity to work there if they would like? Is it an expectation that they go out and do something else and maybe return? Or maybe we just think that this is ultimately going to be shut down. And so that while they may be able to benefit from some of the financial success in the future, they need to find something else to do. Those are the kind of conversations that really need to be had as early as possible. It's unfortunate that some families have to deal with this more than others, but it's just a reality. It's part of having that kind of success. Again, without more specifics, it's a little difficult to give you the impression of exactly what to do. And if you'd like to reach out, I'm happy to help.
Thanks, Chris. One more question here. How do you spell out the caregiving concerns for mom or dad? Children tend to disagree, especially those who don't live locally and see mom and dad on a daily basis.
That's a great question. And that is a totally unique conversation in and of itself. The good news is you're typically not dealing with those problems that such a large percentage of Americans deal with, which is how would we afford the kinds of things that we want? Typically in these families, that's not the concern. But remember when I mentioned like, hey, maybe the home is not the right place to have these meetings. That's a perfect example of an issue that could arise that creates some real tension. I want to stay in this home forever. Why, Mom? Why would you need all this? Especially if you're going to need a bunch of care. Shouldn't we put you in a really pretty place that you can look over the ocean and then, my husband and I can move into this house? Look, how is that going to be dealt with? And there's no simple way to do it, except, of course, first and foremost, the senior generation needs to remain very flexible with their overall plan. It is beneficial typically to have some level of control for as long as you can have it, right? You want to be able to say, look, I have my intentions for me. Now, if I become incapacitated or I'm no longer lucid, then of course, whoever I've listed as my healthcare surrogate, they're going to have to be the ones who decide this. But while I'm around and while I can make decisions, I'm going to make them. And if anybody wants to put up a fight, I still have some levers I can pull that will cause some discomfort for a lot of you. So let's just adhere to that desire of the senior generation. Again, that's sort of that's a broad answer. If we have specifics or anyone would like to reach out, I'm happy to have that discussion. It's 5 past. So thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate it. This may be something we do something like more again, depending on what our feedback is, because I know it's not as technically based as some of the things we do, but I hope it was helpful. Thank you all very much.